Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Just before sunrise in Darlington, Indiana, a modest family home turned into the center of a crime scene involving two children, Tyler Worley, 7, and Charlie Worley, 3. The first entry in the record is a calm voice to 911. Clear location, urgent request for help, no theatrics. That tone matters. It fixes a clock and leaves interpretation for later. Patrol arrived, staged medics, and moved with purpose. The children's bedroom and the short hallway beside it became the primary scene. A basement sleeping area was logged as secondary after officers found an adult male there and escorted him upstairs for a welfare check. The house went quiet again, but this time under control. Doors taped, a single path in and out, every person who crossed it written down. This isn't red tape, it's memory insurance for a jury that doesn't exist yet. In that bedroom, a single combat-style knife was documented near the victims and left in place until evidence techs could collect it. No graphic detail is needed. The point is singular and procedural. One weapon, photographed, bagged, and entered into property with the time and the hands that touched it. Medics did what they could, then detectives took the room from them. The adults at the address were separated, not for drama, but so statements wouldn't contaminate each other before interviews. Nothing here tries to answer why. The first hour only proves what and when. Dispatch logs anchor the minute the call came in. Body-worn timestamps align with who entered which doorway and when. A supervisor in a command SUV asked for 3 confirmations before handing the scene off: the photo count, the perimeter log, and the transport chain for anything leaving the house. If the scene is the anchor, paperwork is the rope. You lose one, you lose both. By the time daylight hit the siding, the room was frozen in a way it would never be again. That freeze is intentional. It allows investigators to step away from tape and toward records that live elsewhere. How the family spent the evening before, who went where, and what was bought. Those questions will either harmonize with this room or they won't. And if they don't, that gap becomes the case. Here's the tension that keeps professionals honest. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. To test it, detectives will rebuild the last ordinary night on paper, practice, dinner, late errand, and then hold those timestamps against what the bedroom just told us. We'll go there next. For now, the scene stands. 2 child victims, a pre-dawn call from inside, a single primary room and hall, 1 recovered knife, adults separated, chain of custody intact. Nothing more, nothing less. Movement either agrees with the room or it doesn't. The bedroom we froze before sunrise will now be tested against the final ordinary hours that came before it. This is not speculation. It's a reconstruction built from third-party records and corroborated statements, exactly the kind of chronology that holds in a U.S. courtroom when a crime takes children's lives. The evening began with a scheduled children's activity. Attendance was verified by the studio's roster and closing time. Staff recognized the family in the ordinary way small communities do: who waited, who signed, who left with whom. These notes matter because they anchor the first-time window with a record that does not depend on memory. From the studio, the family regrouped for dinner. Statements placed both Tyler, 7, and Charlie, 3, at home afterward, awake and tended to. Nothing in those accounts flagged unusual behavior or an argument that would alter timing. For investigators, dinner wasn't color. It was a timestamp that narrowed the gap between the activity and a late errand. That errand, Walmart, shifted the case from recollection to paper. Register data showed items, quantities, payment method, and a precise transaction time. Entry and exit views confirmed arrival and departure without needing close-up identification. The receipt already carried the probative weight. The itemization did not stop at craft supplies. The receipt also listed a combat-style knife. No narrative was attached to that purchase. The record did not need one. A store sold a knife inside the same block of hours that ended in a single knife documented in a child's bedroom. Investigators didn't argue motive here. They matched timestamps. Drive time home was brief and uncomplicated. No additional stops were recorded. Household accounts, who settled the children, who stayed up, who moved between rooms, were taken and logged without pressure to explain intent. The point was sequence. If the paper said the errand ended at a certain minute, the home had to be quieting at a plausible minute before the pre-dawn call to 911. In towns like Darlington, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. That reality never overrides method. The family's descriptions of an ordinary night were accepted and held, then placed alongside the receipt and the drive time. When investigators set those pieces against the floor plan we already documented, bed, hall, doorway, the alignment was clean. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Alignment can tempt shortcuts. The team refused them. Two safeguards followed. First, they tied the payment method on the receipt to the adult who used it, confirming the account holder and who physically carried it that night. Second, they documented the merchandise bag after it entered the home, noting where it was placed and who had access, leaving transfer questions for the lab rather than the living room. The children's last hours remained defined by routine tasks, changing into pajamas, setting out items for the morning, lights going off in normal sequence. Forensically, that consistency matters. It supports the conclusion that the window between the store purchase and the 911 call was narrow enough for the weapon to be acquired, brought into the residence, and later appear as the single item photographed near the victims. No further inference was drawn here. The next phase belongs to documentation and custody. With the movement map established, the case shifts to stewardship of physical evidence. The question now is not whether a knife was bought, but how the weapon in the bedroom was photographed, bagged, logged, and preserved so that later scientific testing can compare it to the transaction that placed one just like it in a shopping bag hours earlier. A homicide scene is only as strong as its paperwork. After the pre-dawn response and the last evening reconstruction, the work inside the Darlington home narrowed to one objective: make the room usable in court. For this crime, that meant disciplined documentation and an unbroken chain of custody. No drama, just verifiable steps. The entry control log came first. One doorway in, one out, with an officer recording every name, badge, time, and reason for entry. Inner and outer perimeters stayed intact. Radios were kept low. Nothing moved until it was photographed. The children's bedroom and the short hallway remained the primary scene. The basement sleeping area where an adult male was located stayed secondary for corroboration only. Photography followed the standard sequence. Overall, mid-range, then close-ups. Wide shots established the room's orientation and the hallway's sightline. Mid-range frames fixed the position of key items relative to immovable reference points, door jambs, bed frame, outlet plates. Close-ups brought in the evidence scale and case card. A simple rule governed each frame. If the picture is clear, the testimony can be simple. A scaled sketch supported the images. Walls were measured, the bed was boxed out, the hallway was drawn with distances to the threshold. North was marked. Measurements were recorded in feet and inches and initialed by the technician. Nothing in the sketch read like interpretation. It was a floor plan with numbers. The weapon was documented in place, a single combat-style knife. Its distance from the bed frame and nearest wall was measured and written on both the sketch and the photo log. No graphic description was needed. The facts that matter are singular. One weapon, visible, recoverable. Before collection, the technician photographed identifying features and made a note to preserve both latent prints and possible touch DNA. Swabbing preceded any processing that could disturb ridge detail. New gloves were used for each step to prevent transfer. Packaging was by the book. The knife went into a rigid container to prevent puncture, then into a paper container suitable for drying and transport. Evidence tape sealed each closure with initials and the minute of sealing written across the seam. An item tag listed the case number, item number, description, location found, collector, and time. A duplicate entry went onto the chain of custody form. From that point forward, the weapon was in custody on paper, not just in someone's hands. Adjacent soft items, select bedding and clothing, were photographed and, where policy required, individually packaged for potential trace, fiber, and DNA work. Each item meant fresh gloves and a clean surface. Items that did not serve a forensic purpose were left undisturbed. Clutter is not evidence. The purpose here was not volume, but relevance. Digital records were locked alongside the physical scene. Dispatch CAD entries and body-worn camera timestamps were pulled for the first minutes inside the house. Those times would later bracket the moment the weapon was first observed, the moment it was collected, and the moment the scene was released. The point is straightforward. In a solid case, the videos and the forms tell the same story. Investigators noted any over-the-counter medications referenced in the initial call if present in plain view, but they drew no conclusions. That kind of reference goes to the lab later for toxicology context. It does not belong in field speculation. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The answer to that problem is process. Photograph, package, seal, log, without reaching for meaning too soon. Once the scene was fully documented, the property officer took custody of sealed items. The chain of custody form was signed at the threshold, then again at the transport vehicle, then at the property room. Each handoff had a time, a name, and a purpose. The weapons package received a barcode and a temporary locker number pending lab transfer. The technician's photo count, the evidence list, and the perimeter log were reconciled by a supervisor before the tape came down. If a number didn't match, nobody left. This is the quiet center of an investigation. Families and communities want reasons. Courts require steps. The steps ensure that when a lab later swabs the handle, lifts prints, or compares class characteristics to a retail record, there's no doubt about where the item came from or what happened to it between the bedroom and the bench. In towns like Darlington, the most respectful thing investigators can do for Tyler and Charlie is to be exact. The bridge out of this room is narrow and deliberate. On one side is documentation, today's work. On the other is corroboration, what independent records say about procurement. With the weapon sealed and logged, detectives move to the purchase evidence that sits outside the home, the receipt, the SKU, and the time. When those numbers line up with what was collected here, the case gains weight without a single raised voice. The next step is narrow by design. Link what was sold to what was seized. For this crime, investigators didn't chase hunches. They built a bridge from a late-evening Walmart transaction to the single weapon logged in the children's bedroom, using records that hold up when the cameras are off and the courtroom lights are on. Store cooperation produced the point-of-sale packet, transaction time, lane, itemization, and the cashier's identifier. The register tape was authenticated as a business record and duplicated for the case file. The original stayed with the retailer. The certified copy went into evidence with a property tag. Even without close-up video, the register entry carried the probative weight because it didn't just say supplies. It listed a combat-style knife alongside ordinary items. That purchase lived inside the same short evening window already mapped in Chapter 2, a window that ended at a Darlington address before the pre-dawn call we fixed in Chapter 1. From there, the task turned technical and careful. The weapon collected at the scene was described on the photo log and in a scaled sketch. The lab would later compare its class characteristics, general type, configuration, and manufacturer-level features to the product profile tied to the receipt's SKU. This is not the moment for conclusions. It's the moment for compatibility checks. If the classes match, the bridge gets stronger. If they don't, the bridge breaks, and that matters just as much. Investigators then handled attribution in the way that survives motions, not message boards. Payment details associated with the transaction were documented through the store, not through speculation, and routed under subpoena into the case file. The question was simple. Who had the means to complete that purchase at that time? The answer would be anchored to records, not to memory. The result helped narrow access without naming motive. Surveillance served as a timekeeper, not a storyteller. Entry and exit views established arrival and departure near the register time. No one needed to narrate posture or expression. Distance to the home was short, the route plain. That left only the interval between a scanned SKU and a photographed weapon. An interval the timeline already showed was tight. Discipline kept investigators from declaring intent. Indiana prosecutors would later argue preparation using the same documents. The people in the room stayed focused on sequence. One safeguard protected against overreach. The receipt's knife entry was treated as a transactional fact, not a personality test. Detectives documented who possessed the shopping bag after it entered the house and where it was placed, then let the lab decide what, if any, trace or latent detail could be developed from the bag or packaging if available. Field notes do not replace chemistry. They point chemistry in the right direction. Another safeguard preserved fairness. Household statements about the errand's purpose were captured and held without confrontation. In homicide work, contradiction isn't hunted, it's measured. If statements about a craft supply run sit beside a register line showing a knife in the same cart, the measurement happens later, under oath, with exhibits. The file remains neutral until the science and the records are read together. There is a human cost to this kind of precision, and it isn't theatrical. It's the quiet recognition that Tyler and Charlie deserve a record that doesn't wobble, one that shows how a product number in a store became a physical item logged near two children in a bedroom. In towns like Darlington, the ordinary systems people live inside, class schedules, dinner hours, checkout lanes, end up doing the heavy lifting when everything else falls apart. Those systems don't feel heroic. They feel exact. And exact is what justice needs. The bridge forward is now clear. We have a room, a weapon, and a purchase that can be tested for class agreement. The next layer isn't legal argument, it's medical fact. The medical examiner will define what the bodies can and cannot say about timing and mechanism. Findings that either harmonize with the procurement timeline or expose a gap big enough to matter. The room in Darlington gave us sequence. The autopsy gives us boundaries. At Terre Haute Regional Hospital, a board-certified medical examiner took custody under documented seal numbers. The forms were routine but critical: identification, receipt of remains, and a note matching each seal to the scene log. Nothing moved forward until paperwork matched the chain already opened at the house. That is how a crime stays on paper as much as it lives in memory. Examination was standard: external, internal, documentation of injuries, and collection of trace. The conclusions that matter are spare and precise: cause of death, stab wounds, manner of death, homicide. No estimates of motive, no narratives about emotion, only the recognition that sharp force injuries were sufficient to cause death in two children, Tyler and Charlie. Time of injury could not be pegged to the minute, and the report stated that plainly: pathology can draw edges, it cannot fill in feelings. Injuries were photographed with scales and case cards. Measurements were noted in centimeters and cross-referenced to the body diagrams that become exhibits later. These diagrams don't dramatize, they locate and count. The examiner documented wound characteristics that speak in general terms to a sharp single-edge configuration. That description was held for the lab to compare to the weapon's class, not treated as a match by itself. Pathology identifies what injuries did. Toolmark and lab work address what could have made them. Toxicology was collected because thoroughness demands it, especially in deaths involving children. Samples were drawn and sealed: blood, urine, and, if policy required, vitreous. The purpose is not to speculate about impairment, it is to rule out or rule in substances that might bear on caregiving decisions or medical history. Results would be communicated to investigators when available, but no one in the exam room tried to read the future through a lab vial. The report would say what it could say and stop where it must stop. The chain of custody for the recovered weapon intersected here only on paper. The examiner did not test the knife. That work belongs to the crime lab under separate protocols. What the medical side could add was a careful note about general compatibility, injury patterns that do not contradict a single-edge instrument. This is cautious language on purpose. Consistent with is not identical to. That distinction preserves fairness and prevents overreach during charging and sentencing. The autopsy timeline matters because it either supports or strains the procurement window we established earlier. Temperature, environment, and the interval between pronouncement and examination were documented. None of that produced an exact clock, but it did nothing to disturb the narrow window from late-night purchase to pre-dawn 911. In homicide work, a non-contradiction is sometimes as powerful as a match. It means the story the documents tell, receipt, drive, house, doesn't break under medical scrutiny. Notifications and identification procedures were handled with the restraint these cases require. When children are involved, the most respectful posture is accuracy. The examiner's office coordinated with investigators on death certificates, ensuring the language for cause and manner tracked precisely with the autopsy findings. Those words will move through courts, insurance, and records. They need to be correct once, so they never have to be corrected later. There is a small but meaningful human reality inside work this technical. Families are often asked to absorb conclusions that are both devastating and short. Stab wounds. Homicide. These are sentences you can say in a breath but live with forever. In towns like Darlington, the community carries that weight along with the family, and the only honest service professionals can provide is a file that holds up when grief is loud and rumors are louder. Investigators left the medical suite with exactly what they came for: verified cause, verified manner, and no medical anomaly to undermine the sequence anchored by procurement and scene work. The next phase moves to recorded words, first the 911 audio, then formal interviews, and the legal posture that follows. That's where attribution stops being an inference and becomes a record. The bridge is clean, the purchase can be tested against the weapon can be tested against injury class. And the injuries have been certified without stretching beyond science. From here, the case shifts from scalpel to statements. Medical findings drew the edges, recorded words fill the center. For this crime, the most powerful evidence after the scene and the autopsy is what was captured in real time and what was said carefully, lawfully, soon after. Dispatch preserved the 911 audio under standard public safety procedures. The file carries a unique incident number, automatic timestamps, and a log of every transfer inside the center. The caller is an adult female inside the residence. Her voice is steady. She confirms the address, states there are 2 injured children, notes that she has injured herself, and requests help. The tone does not decide anything. It anchors the clock. The computer-aided dispatch record and call detail report match the times we've already built from first response and scene photos. There is one line the law treats as both relevant and memorable, and it belongs here, once. Now you can't take the kids from me. It appears in the official record of the call. It will not be repeated again in this series because evidence is not stronger by being echoed. Its meaning is an issue for court and context, not for narration. Here, it is a data point that connects to custody tension already documented in public filings and later sentencing arguments. Authentication followed chain of custody logic. A custodian from the dispatch center certified the recording as a business record. A working copy was created for investigators. The original remained secure. A court reporter later produced a verbatim transcript with line numbers, paired with the audio's time code, so that minutes on paper match minutes in the file. This prevents arguments about what was said or when it was said from turning into guesswork months later. Responders' body-worn cameras and in-car video provide the next set of timestamps. Arrival times, entry into the home, and the handoff to medics align with the call record. The effect is simple and decisive. 3 independent clocks, dispatch, car video, and body-worn cameras tell the same story. When timing holds, narrative drift disappears. Early interviews were kept clean by separation and by respect for rights. The adult male located in the basement sleeping space, the children's father, gave a non-custodial statement to a separate officer. The questions were limited to movement and awareness: where he slept, when he last saw the children, whether he heard anything overnight. His account aligns with the room designations we've already established. Primary scene in the children's bedroom and adjacent hall, secondary scene in the basement. The value of that alignment is not drama, it is corroboration. The adult female caller was cleared medically before any detailed questioning. Investigators documented any unprompted remarks as spontaneous utterances, which are admissible without Miranda warnings because they are not the product of interrogation. Once she was deemed stable and any interview turned investigative, Miranda procedures were observed. The interview was recorded, the rights form was signed, and questions were confined to timeline and actions. This is where strong cases avoid contamination. No leading, no promises, no off-the-record comments. Words either stand or they don't, and the only way to know is to keep the tape running and the process correct. Statements from both adults were logged with exact start and end times. Property and photo logs from the scene sit beside those statements in the same binder. When prosecutors later open the file, they find a synchronized system: call, arrival, room, words. Nothing in the interviews contradicts the physical sequence we've documented. Crucially, nothing in the autopsy undermines the hour-by-hour window between Walmart procurement and the pre-dawn call. The case becomes sturdier, not because anyone speaks at length, but because every record speaks at the right minute. It's worth noting the emotional economy of this phase. Communities want motives. Investigators need reliability. The single quoted line from the call suggests a custody dispute. The file will carry that suggestion forward through charging, plea, and sentencing. Here we let the quote sit where it belongs, next to the clock, the address, and the request for help. Accuracy is respect for Tyler, for Charlie, and for a father whose life now moves between statements and courtrooms. With recorded words, authenticated, and interviews secured, attribution becomes a matter of procedure, not personality. The timeline is intact. The geography is unchanged. The next step belongs to the courts: charging decisions, competency evaluations, the handling of any insanity notice, and ultimately the plea that fixes guilt before sentencing. The case leaves microphones and enters the calendar. When the lab work was queued and the recording certified, the file moved from detectives to prosecutors. For this crime, the transition was procedural, not theatrical. A probable cause affidavit, a charging decision, and a court calendar that would carry the case to judgment. The county filed 2 counts of murder tied to the deaths of Tyler Worley, 7, and Charlie Worley, 3. The affidavit outlined the sequence already built in the record: the pre-dawn call from inside the home, the single primary scene, the weapon recovered and logged, the late evening purchase documentation, and the medical examiner's conclusions. The filing didn't argue feelings. It argued sequence and access. The judge set the initial hearing and appointed counsel. From the first appearance forward, 2 legal questions control cases like this: competency to stand trial and whether an insanity defense will be raised. Competency asks one thing: can the defendant understand the proceedings and assist counsel now? And the court ordered evaluations by qualified clinicians. Reports came back in plain terms: the defendant was competent. That finding let the case advance to trial settings without interruption. Insanity is a different legal standard in Indiana. It looks backward to the time of the act and asks whether a mental disease or defect rendered the defendant unable to appreciate wrongfulness. Defense counsel filed notice to preserve that option, triggering additional evaluations. Those reports enter under seal, and the language stays careful. Diagnoses, observations, and opinions tied to statutory criteria. Prosecutors do not get a shortcut. The law requires the process even when the paper record, involving procurement, timing, and recorded words, already appears strong. With competency established and the insanity posture defined, court set a schedule that included pretrial motions and status checks. Meanwhile, the evidence stayed where it belonged: sealed in property, queued at the lab, organized in binders. Detectives did not add commentary. Prosecutors prepared exhibits built from what you've already heard: dispatch audio, body-worn timestamps, photographs, purchase records, and the autopsy report. The case was ready for trial if needed and ready for a plea if offered. That decision arrived early the following year. Brandy Worley entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of murder. The plea was taken in open court under oath. The judge confirmed that the defendant understood rights, possible penalties, and the facts supporting the plea. There was no trial. There was no jury. There was a transcript that reads like most sound plea hearings: yes, no answers to the judge's questions, and a brief factual basis establishing what happened and who was responsible. 2 points matter for the record. First, the plea was consistent with the evidence you've seen assembled: scene control, procurement records, medical findings, and authenticated statements. Second, the plea did not set the sentence. In Indiana, the court retains discretion within statutory ranges. That means the case shifted immediately into a sentencing posture where victim impact statements, criminal history, and aggravating and mitigating factors would be weighed. For families and communities, pleas land hard. They end the question of guilt, but they do not answer the question everyone keeps privately: why? The law can't supply that answer. What it can do is impose a penalty proportionate to the facts on paper: 2 children dead, a prepared act, and a house where the clocks, the receipts, and the recordings agreed. The plea recognizes responsibility. Sentencing measures consequence. To keep the narrative straight, geography remains unchanged: Montgomery Circuit Court in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and the timeline stays relative, anchored to the pre-dawn call and the subsequent months of evaluations and hearings. Nothing in the plea record alters the sequence fixed by investigators. It simply removes the uncertainty of a trial and clears the way for a single final outcome. Next, the court will hear what it must before imposing years: the state's argument on premeditation and vulnerability, the defense's mitigation, the father's statement, and the judge's findings. The file is ready. The law is ready. The sentence will define the ending that this series has promised from the start. The record is complete. A pre-dawn 911 call from a Darlington home set the clock. Officers contained a single primary scene. A weapon was documented and preserved. A late evening Walmart receipt showed procurement within hours. The medical examiner certified stab wounds and homicide. Recordings and interviews were authenticated. Prosecutors charged 2 counts. Brandy Worley pleaded guilty. A judge imposed one outcome. This is a single crime with a single ending. In Montgomery Circuit Court, Crawfordsville, Indiana, the court weighed aggravation and mitigation and pronounced consecutive terms: 65 years for Charlie Worley, 3, and 55 years for Tyler Worley. 7, 120 years total. No second path exists in this file. The sentence stands on the same spine you followed: clocks that match, receipts that anchor, medical findings that hold, and statements kept within the rules. Custody transferred to the Indiana Department of Correction. Consistent with the geography chain, Brandy Worley is housed within the state system for women, Rockville Custody. As of August 18, 2025, there is no resentencing or vacature altering the 120-year term. The law spoke once on the record, and it remains in force. What remains is not speculation, but responsibility. Cases like this teach 3 plain lessons that serve victims without sensationalism. First, documentation protects truth, from scene logs to business records. Second, early intervention matters. Custody conflict and acute relationship breakdowns are risk markers that warrant immediate support. Third, accuracy is respect, for Tyler and Charlie, for their father, and for a community that must live with the facts, not rumors. We close where we began. 1 house, 2 children, 1 timeline that never needed embellishment. Justice here is a paper trail that held under pressure. Hold fast to that standard, in homes, in courts, and in how we remember the victims by their names and not by speculation. I'll leave you with this. We followed 1 crime, 1 timeline, 1 ending, because truth deserves precision. What I carry forward is simple: document the facts, speak up early when families are in crisis, and honor victims with accuracy, not rumor. What warning signs do communities overlook? How should courts balance preparation, mental health, and accountability? If this story moved you, tell me what stood out and where you're watching from. If it didn't, say why. Your voice guides what we examine next. If you value clear, respectful cases, please subscribe to the channel.